Close your eyes now, and imagine a world where the bullets never found him. October 9th, 1967. A schoolhouse in La Higuera, Bolivia, the executioner's rifle raised. But in this timeline, in this gentle fold of possibility, the trigger never pulls. Che Guevara does not become a martyr that day. He does not freeze into the iconic image on a million t-shirts. Instead, he breathes, he continues, he lives. The revolutionary who helped topple Batista, who rode alongside Fidel into Havana, who dreamed of continental liberation, does not die. And so the question unfolds like a slow river through the centuries ahead. What becomes of Cuba? What becomes of the world? When Che Guevara cannot be made into a saint, cannot be turned into a symbol, because he is still here, still aging, still making choices, still living with consequences. This is not a story of triumph. This is not a story of failure. This is a story of time, and what it does to revolutionaries who do not get to escape into legend. Let us walk forward now, slowly, through the decades, and see what becomes of the man and the island, when immortality is granted not through death, but through survival. Bolivia, 1967. The capture happens as it did. The exhaustion, the betrayal, the peasants who would not rise, the CIA advisors circling like patient birds. But the execution order falters. Perhaps a hesitation. Perhaps a message from Havana that carries weight. Perhaps Fidel himself intervenes, unwilling to lose his comrade to martyrdom when propaganda might serve better. Che is imprisoned instead. Months pass in a Bolivian cell, and the world watches, uncertain. The young radicals in Paris and Berkeley and Mexico City hold vigils, but there is no beautiful death to mythologize, no final photograph of the fallen guerrilla that looks like Renaissance art. There is only a living prisoner, aging, exhausted, his asthma worsening in the cold mountain air. By early 1968, through negotiations that involve the Soviets, through back channels that trade silence for release, Che Guevara returns to Cuba. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in quiet, complicated survival. He is 40 years old. The revolutionary dream in Latin America has failed. The peasants did not rise. The Foucault theory, his beautiful, tragic idea that small guerrilla groups could ignite mass revolution, has been tested in the jungles and found wanting. And now he must return to the island he helped liberate, to face what comes next. Havana, 1968. The city is changing. The revolutionary offensive is underway, nationalizing the last private businesses, pushing toward total state control. Che returns to an island that is both his creation and increasingly foreign to him. Fidel welcomes him, but there is distance now, a careful choreography. Che is given a position, a title, but not power. He oversees agricultural projects, industrial reforms, the same grinding bureaucratic work he fled when he left for the Congo in 1965. He is celebrated in public, his image still printed on banners, but he is also confined. The revolution no longer needs the purity he represented. It needs pragmatism now, Soviet oil, sugar quotas, the machinery of survival under embargo. Che attends meetings. He writes. He watches as the idealism of the early years hardens into something else, something more durable but less luminous. He sees the young revolutionaries growing older, sees the songs becoming rituals, sees the passion becoming policy. And he remembers the Sierra Maestra, the nights in the mountains when everything seemed possible, when every bullet fired felt like it was liberating the future itself. But memory is not enough to live on. And so he adapts, slowly, reluctantly, the way revolutionaries must when they do not get to die young. The 1970s arrive, and with them, a Cuba that is both isolated and ambitious. Che is in his 40s now, his asthma a constant companion, his body marked by years of jungle warfare and deprivation. He is no longer the young Argentine doctor who joined a rebellion. He is an aging functionary in a revolution that has settled into the long, grinding work of governance. But he cannot stay still. In 1975, when Cuba sends troops to Angola to support the MPLA against South African-backed forces, Che requests permission to go. Fidel hesitates, but eventually allows it. Perhaps he sees in Che's eyes the same restlessness that sent him to Bolivia. Perhaps he understands that some men cannot live without fighting. And so Che goes to Africa again, not as a guerrilla this time, but as an advisor, a mentor to younger commanders. The Angolan conflict is vast, confusing, a Cold War proxy battle fought in red dust and tropical heat. Che watches Cuban soldiers, many born after the revolution, fight and die for a cause thousands of miles from home. He writes letters back to Havana, philosophical now, less certain. He wonders aloud on paper whether revolution can be exported, or whether each nation must find its own path through blood and compromise. The war drags on. Che survives it. He returns to Cuba in 1978, older still, quieter, his legend dimming slightly with each year he continues to breathe. The 1980s, a decade of contradictions. The Soviet Union, Cuba's lifeline, begins to show cracks that will eventually shatter it. But for now, the subsidies continue, the sugar purchases continue, and Cuba survives in its strange revolutionary stasis. Che is in his 50s, a grandfather now, his children grown in a Cuba that has never known anything but revolution. He teaches occasionally at the university, lectures on political economy, on the moral incentives he once championed over material ones. Students listen, respectful, but they were born into a world where Che Guevara is already history, already a name in textbooks. They do not see the firebrand. They see a professor with grey in his beard and an inhaler in his pocket. In 1986, Fidel launches the Rectification Campaign, an attempt to revive revolutionary purity, to push back against Soviet-style bureaucracy and material incentives. It is, in some ways, a return to Che's early ideas, and he is brought forward again, asked to speak, to inspire. He does his best. He talks about the new man, about working not for personal gain but for collective good, about moral consciousness as the engine of socialism. But the words feel hollow now, even to him. He has lived long enough to see how difficult it is to sustain idealism, how hunger and exhaustion and human nature wear away at the most beautiful theories. The campaign sputters. The economy continues to struggle. And Che continues to age, continues to watch. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Che watches on television as East Germans pour through the checkpoints, as the barrier that symbolized the Cold War division crumbles in a single night. He is 61 years old. He has lived long enough to see the world he fought to create begin to collapse. The Soviet Union is unraveling. Eastern Europe is turning away from communism. And Cuba, Cuba is about to face its greatest crisis since the revolution. The special period begins in 1991, when Soviet subsidies vanish almost overnight. The island plunges into economic freefall. Food shortages, blackouts, transportation grinding to a halt. Che, like all Cubans, suffers. He grows thinner. He rides a bicycle through Havana streets because there is no gasoline. He tends a small garden because there is not enough food. This is not the romantic suffering of guerrilla warfare. This is the slow, grinding deprivation of a failing system with no easy exit. Fidel remains in power, but even he must make concessions, opening to limited foreign investment, allowing the dollar, permitting small private enterprises. Everything Che once argued against. Everything he warned would corrupt the revolution. And he is still here to see it happen. In meetings, when he is consulted, he argues quietly for maintaining principles, but his voice is one among many now, and the hunger is louder than ideology. Cuba survives the special period, but it survives by compromising, by adapting, by becoming something neither purely revolutionary nor purely capitalist, but a strange hybrid born of necessity. The new millennium arrives, and Che Guevara is 72 years old. The 20th century, the century of revolutions and world wars and ideological battles, is over. The 21st century begins in a world where capitalism has declared victory, where the Soviet Union is a memory, where China calls itself communist but operates vast market economies. Cuba persists, an island frozen in time in some ways, evolving in others. Tourism grows. Canadians and Europeans walk through old Havana, taking photographs, buying rum and cigars. The revolution has become a tourist attraction. Che's images everywhere, of course, on murals, on currency, in the museums. But it is the image from 1960, the young Che with the beret and the distant gaze, captured by Alberto Corda. It is not him, not the old man with the walker now, not the grandfather who wheezes through Havana's humid summers. There is a strange doubling, the icon and the man, existing side by side, barely recognizable as the same person. In 2006, Fidel falls ill, temporarily transfers power to Raúl. Che watches his old comrade fade, the man who led them into Havana, who outlasted every American president who tried to destroy him, who became the revolution itself. Fidel recovers somewhat, but he is no longer in command. Raúl takes over officially in 2008, and the island begins another slow shift toward market reforms, toward opening, toward pragmatism. Che attends ceremonies. He is honored, respected, treated with the reverence due to a founding father. But he is also peripheral. The decisions are made by younger men who see the world differently, who grew up after the revolution, who know that survival requires flexibility that Che's generation never quite mastered. 2014, Barack Obama and Raúl Castro announced the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba. After more than 50 years of hostility, the Cold War's last standoff begins to thaw. Che is 86 years old. He watches the ceremony on television, sees the handshake, hears the speeches about new beginnings. And he feels, what? Relief? Betrayal? Confusion? He has lived long enough to see the enemy his generation fought against extend a hand in partnership. He has lived long enough to see the embargo that strangled Cuba for decades begin to lift, not through revolutionary victory, but through negotiation, through compromise, through the simple passage of time. Young Cubans celebrate in the streets. They are excited about the internet, about travel possibilities, about American goods that might finally arrive. They were not alive for the Bay of Pigs, for the missile crisis, for the years when invasion felt imminent. They do not carry Che's memories. In interviews, which he rarely gives anymore, Che is diplomatic. He says that peace is preferable to war, that the Cuban people deserve relief from hardship. But privately, in conversations with old comrades, he wonders whether they simply outlasted their principles, whether survival became more important than the dream. Fidel dies in 2016, at 90. Che attends the funeral, one of the last living links to the revolution's beginning. He stands in the Plaza de la Revolution, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of mourners, and he remembers the Sierra Maestra again, always the Sierra Maestra, when they were young and hungry and certain that history was on their side. The late 2010s, and into the 2020s, Cuba continues its slow, complicated evolution. A new constitution in 2019 acknowledges private property, though socialism remains official policy. The internet, once heavily restricted, becomes more accessible. Young Cubans scroll through social media, watch YouTube, see a world beyond the island. Che is in his 90s now, frail but still present, still occasionally wheeled out for state functions, still a symbol, though few remember why anymore. The protests of July 2021 shock the government. Thousands of Cubans taking to the streets, demanding freedom, demanding change, demanding an end to one-party rule. It is the largest unrest since the revolution. The government cracks down, arrests hundreds, and the moment passes. But something has shifted. Che watches the videos online, sees young people shouting slogans that would have meant execution in earlier decades, and he realizes that the revolution has outlived its own mythology. The generation that made it is almost entirely gone. The generation that inherits it wants something different. He writes, slowly, in notebooks that he knows will be published after his death. He writes about intentions and outcomes, about how revolutions begin with dreams of justice and end with the same human problems they tried to solve. He writes about violence, about whether it can ever truly build something beautiful, or whether it only clears ground that must be built upon with patience and compromise. He writes about Cuba, the island that he helped liberate and then watched struggle for 60 years to become what it hoped to be. He does not have answers. He has only observations, memories, the long view that comes from not dying when you were supposed to. 2023, 2024. Che Guevara is 96 years old. He lives quietly in Havana, cared for by family, visited occasionally by historians and filmmakers who want to capture his memories before they are gone. He sits on a balcony overlooking the Malecon, watching the waves crash against the seawall that has weathered hurricanes and revolutions and the simple, relentless passage of time. Cuba is changing still. Miguel Diaz-Canel, the first leader born after the revolution, is president. The old guard is dying off, one by one. The statues remain, the murals remain, but the living memory fades. Young Cubans argue online about cryptocurrency and immigration, and whether socialism ever really had a chance, or whether it was doomed from the start by geography and empire and human nature. Che does not engage much anymore. His asthma has worsened with age. His hands shake. But his mind is still sharp, still turning over the same questions he has asked for 60 years. What was it all for? Did the suffering produce anything lasting? Did the revolution improve lives, or simply trade one set of problems for another? He thinks about the people he killed, because there were many, in the revolutionary tribunals and the guerrilla campaigns. He thinks about the people who died believing in the dream he helped articulate. He thinks about the children who grew up under the revolution, some grateful for free education and healthcare, some resentful of poverty and restriction, most simply living their lives in the complicated middle ground where all ideology eventually settles. And he thinks about himself, the young doctor from Argentina who joined a revolution in a country not his own, who became a symbol larger than any individual, who somehow survived when he should have died, and who now must reckon with what survival actually means. The historians ask him sometimes, if he could go back, would he do it all again? Would he storm the Moncada barracks? Would he march through the Sierra Maestra? Would he oversee the tribunals, sign the execution orders, leave Cuba to spread revolution elsewhere? And Che pauses, always pauses, before answering, because the question assumes a clarity that time has eroded. He remembers the Batista years, the casinos and brothels and American companies owning the island's wealth while campesinos starved. He remembers genuine oppression, genuine injustice, the kind that makes violence feel not just justified but necessary. And he remembers the early days after victory, the literacy campaigns, the doctors sent to the countryside, the genuine attempt to build something more equal, more humane. But he also remembers the firing squads. He remembers the labor camps, though they called them something else. He remembers the intellectuals who were silenced, the artists who fled, the gay men who were persecuted, the Afro-Cubans who found that revolution did not erase racism, only complicated it. He remembers the poverty that never quite went away, that sometimes deepened, that made daily life a struggle for resources that the revolution promised would be abundant. So he tells the historians, it was necessary and it was flawed. It was liberation and it was oppression. It was both, always both, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something, either nostalgia or propaganda. The truth is that they tried to build heaven and built something more human instead, imperfect, struggling, sometimes cruel, sometimes beautiful, always complicated. There are moments when Che dreams he is young again, riding a motorcycle across South America, practicing medicine in leper colonies, watching injustice and feeling the fire in his chest that would eventually consume his entire life. In the dreams, he has not yet met Fidel. He has not yet become a revolutionary. He is still Ernesto, still searching, still trying to understand the world. And then he wakes, 96 years old, in a Havana that feels both familiar and alien, and realizes that the searching never ended, that he has been trying to understand the world for 7 decades and is no closer to certainty than when he started. The young revolutionaries in other countries still invoke his name sometimes, in protests in Chile, in movements in Bolivia, in leftist gatherings around the world. They wear his face on t-shirts, they quote his speeches, they imagine him as pure, as uncorrupted, as the revolutionary who never compromised. And Che, watching from his balcony, feels a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Because they love an icon, not a man. They love the Che who died at 39, who never had to manage an economy or negotiate with superpowers or watch his ideals wither in the harsh light of implementation. They love the Che who never grew old, never grew tired, never had to survive. And he cannot begrudge them that love, because perhaps that icon serves a purpose. Perhaps it inspires people to fight injustice in their own contexts, to demand better, to refuse to accept oppression as inevitable. But he also knows, with the weariness of age, that inspiration is the easy part. The hard part is what comes after: building, maintaining, adapting, living with the consequences of your victories. Cuba in the mid-2020s is a nation in flux, as it has always been, as perhaps all nations always are if you watch them long enough. The embargo has eased but not ended. The internet has opened but is still monitored. The economy limps along, dependent on tourism and remittances and the occasional windfall from Venezuelan oil, itself uncertain. Young people leave when they can, seeking opportunities in Miami or Madrid or Santiago. They love Cuba, most of them, but love is not enough to overcome limited prospects and the simple desire to see what else is possible. Che understands this. He remembers leaving Argentina, leaving his comfortable medical career, seeking something more, something meaningful. The leaving is human. The yearning for possibility is human. But it also means that Cuba continues to lose its brightest, its most ambitious, its young people who might build the future if the future seemed to have room for them. The government tries to adapt, introduces reforms, permits small businesses, allows more foreign investment. But it moves slowly, always slowly, afraid of losing control, afraid of what might happen if the floodgates open fully. And so the island exists in a strange limbo, neither fully closed nor fully open, neither fully socialist nor fully capitalist, neither fully repressive nor fully free. Che has lived long enough to see that this middle ground, uncomfortable as it is, might be the only viable space for Cuba. That the pure revolution he once envisioned was never sustainable, that the choice was never between utopia and dystopia, but between different shades of imperfect governance, different distributions of suffering and prosperity. There is a question that haunts Che in his old age. Would it have been better if he had died in Bolivia? Not for him, necessarily, but for the revolution, for Cuba, for the idea of what revolutionary change could mean. Because martyrdom is powerful. Martyrdom is clarifying. A dead revolutionary can be anything, can represent any ideal, can be frozen at the moment of their greatest purity. But a living revolutionary must compromise, must adapt, must watch their dreams collide with reality and shatter into something less luminous but perhaps more honest. If he had died at 39, he would be remembered purely as the guerrilla, the idealist, the man who gave everything for liberation. Instead, he is remembered as, what? A survivor? A functionary? A living relic of a revolution that has long since moved beyond the men who made it. He discusses this sometimes with the few old comrades who remain, men and women in their 80s and 90s, veterans of the Sierra Maestra and the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis. And they laugh, the dry laughter of the very old, because what else can they do? They made history. They changed the world, for better and worse. They survived. And now they live in the aftermath, watching new generations argue about what it all meant, watching historians pick apart their decisions, watching the revolution become something none of them quite intended or imagined. It is both a privilege and a burden, this survival. To watch the consequences unfold. To see the complexity that simple narratives cannot capture. to know too much to be certain of anything. The visitors come less frequently now. Che is too old, too frail, and the world has moved on to newer revolutions, newer crises, newer heroes and villains. Occasionally a documentary crew arrives, wanting to capture his final thoughts, wanting to ask the questions that everyone wants answered. Was it worth it? Did you succeed? What should we learn from your life? And Che tries to answer honestly, though honesty is difficult when speaking for history, when every word will be analyzed and quoted and used to prove someone else's point. He says that the revolution was both necessary and costly, that Batista had to be overthrown, but that what they built afterward was not what they imagined. That socialism in Cuba survived against impossible odds, but that survival required compromises that betrayed some of the original vision. That he is proud of the literacy, the healthcare, the dignity they tried to provide to the poor. That he regrets the violence, the intolerance, the lives crushed in the machinery of revolutionary purity. That if he could do it again, he would do it differently, but he does not know exactly how, because the problems they faced had no easy solutions, only difficult choices between bad options. The interviewers want something cleaner than this. They want either redemption or repentance, either vindication or condemnation. But Che has lived too long to give them simple answers. He has seen too much. He has watched the 20th century turn into the 21st, has watched the Cold War end and new conflicts begin, has watched communism fall in most places and survive awkwardly in a few, has watched his own face become a commodity sold on t-shirts and posters to people who have no idea what he actually believed. History, he realizes, is not a story with a moral. It is a river, and he has been carried downstream for 96 years, sometimes swimming, sometimes drowning, mostly just trying to stay afloat. 2025 arrives, and with it, new uncertainties. The world is grappling with climate change, artificial intelligence, economic inequality that rivals the Gilded Age. Cuba faces these challenges too, with fewer resources, more constraints. The seas are rising around the island, threatening coastal cities. The hurricanes are stronger, more frequent. The young people scroll through phones showing them a world of abundance they cannot access, creating tensions that the government struggles to manage. Che watches, and he wonders, if they could start over now, knowing what they know, what would they build? Would it still be socialism, or something else entirely, something that borrows from multiple systems, something pragmatic rather than ideological? Would they prioritize democracy over economic control? Or would they still believe that political freedom is meaningless without economic justice? He does not know. He knows only that the questions remain, that each generation must answer them anew, that his generation's answers were shaped by their specific moment in history and cannot simply be transplanted forward. The revolution was made by people who had lived through colonialism and dictatorship, who had seen American companies exploit the island, who believed that only total transformation could break the cycle of oppression. But the young Cubans today have different experiences, different needs, different dreams. They deserve the chance to build their own future, not to be forever bound by the decisions of men like him, men who are dying off, men who belong to history now rather than to the present. There is a photograph from 1959, taken just after the victory. Che and Fidel and Raúl and Camilo Cienfuegos, all young, all grinning, all exhausted but exhilarated. the bearded guerrillas who had done the impossible. Che keeps a copy of this photograph in his room, and he looks at it sometimes, trying to remember what it felt like to be that person, to be 31 years old and victorious and certain that the hard part was over. How naive they were. How utterly, tragically naive. They thought that taking power was the revolution, but taking power was only the beginning. The revolution was everything that came after. The economic decisions, the diplomatic maneuvering, the daily grind of governance, the slow discovery that changing society is infinitely more difficult than changing governments. 3 of the 4 men in that photograph are dead now. Camilo died in a plane crash in 1959, never having to see the compromises that followed. Fidel died in 2016, having ruled for nearly 50 years, having become the very thing they once fought against in some ways, an autocrat who would not relinquish power, who believed that he alone could guide the revolution safely through dangerous waters. Raúl died in 2023, having tried to manage the transition to a new generation, having opened the economy incrementally, cautiously, always afraid of moving too fast or too slow. And Che alone remains, the last of that group of young revolutionaries, living with all their ghosts. He thinks about his children sometimes, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. They are Cubans, but they are also citizens of a world he barely recognizes. They use technology he does not understand. They listen to music that sounds like noise to him. They have dreams that have nothing to do with revolution, dreams of travel, of careers, of personal fulfillment. And he is glad for them. He is glad they do not have to fight the way he fought. But there is also a sadness, a sense that something has been lost, some clarity of purpose that his generation had and that subsequent generations may never know. Though perhaps that loss is also a gain. Perhaps clarity is dangerous. Perhaps the certainty that made them willing to kill for their ideals was the same certainty that made them unable to see the flaws in those ideals until it was too late. Perhaps the ambiguity that frustrates him in the younger generation is actually healthier, more humane, less likely to produce the kind of violence that revolution requires. He tells his grandchildren stories sometimes, about the motorcycle journey, about the Sierra Maestra, about the early days in Havana. They listen politely, but he can see their eyes glaze over. These are old stories, ancient history, as remote to them as the Spanish conquest. They love him, but they do not share his nostalgia, do not understand why these memories still burn in him, still define him. And that is as it should be. Every generation must make its own mistakes, must fight its own battles, must find its own way forward. His generation's time is over. The revolution they made belongs to history now, to be studied and debated and learned from, but not to be repeated. Late 2025, and Che's health is failing. The asthma that has plagued him all his life is winning now, filling his lungs with fluid, making each breath a struggle. He is 97 years old. He has lived longer than anyone expected, longer than he expected, certainly longer than he would have lived if that Bolivian schoolhouse had been his ending. The doctors do what they can, but there is only so much medical science can do against age and time. He drifts in and out of consciousness, sometimes in his balcony overlooking Havana, sometimes in memory, sometimes in dreams where the dead are alive again and the revolution is still young and full of promise. He sees Alberto Granado, his traveling companion from the motorcycle journey, showing him the poverty and injustice that radicalized him. He sees Camillo laughing, always laughing, the most beloved of the revolutionaries, whose early death spared him from disillusionment. He sees Fidel arguing, strategizing, that brilliant, exhausting, megalomaniacal mind always convinced it knew the only way forward. He sees the peasants in the Sierra Maestra who fed them and hid them and believed in them, many of whom did not live to see the victory. He sees the firing squad victims, the ones whose executions he approved or carried out, the ones whose faces still visit him in the quiet moments, whose ghosts ask whether justice required their deaths or whether revolutionary fervor simply made killing easier to justify. He has no good answer for them. He never has. The revolution required violence, but violence corrupted the revolution. Both things are true. Both things will always be true. And so we arrive at the present moment, at the edge of 2026, at a Cuba that is still itself but also transformed, at a Che Guevara who is still breathing, still present, 97 years old and fading but not yet gone. The island continues below his balcony. The waves crash against the Malecon as they always have. The sun rises over Havana, illuminating the colonial buildings and Soviet-era apartments and new hotels, the layered history visible in the architecture. People go about their lives, arguing, laughing, struggling, surviving, loving, dreaming. The revolution continues, though what it means now is different than what it meant in 1959, different than what it meant in 1989, different than what it will mean in 2050 when everyone who made it is gone. Che watches when he can, when his eyes will focus, when his lungs will allow him to sit up long enough. And he thinks about legacy, about what he will leave behind. Not the icon, which was created without his permission and which he cannot control. Not the t-shirts or the murals or the revolutionary slogans, but the actual, tangible consequences of his life, a Cuba that is free from Batista but not free in other ways, a healthcare system that is the envy of the developing world but an economy that still struggles to provide basic goods, an educational system that is excellent but a political system that does not permit dissent, a nation that maintained dignity and sovereignty against American pressure, but paid an enormous price in poverty and isolation. Was it worth it? The question has no answer, or too many answers, depending on who is asking and what they value. For the peasant who learned to read through the literacy campaign, yes. For the gay man sent to a labor camp, no. For the doctor who received free education and now serves in Haiti or Venezuela, yes. For the dissident rotting in prison for speaking against the government, no. Revolution always creates winners and losers, liberates some while oppressing others, and Che has lived long enough to see both sides clearly, to hold the contradictions without resolving them. The sun sets over Havana. The music drifts up from the streets, Son Cubano and reggaeton mixing in the warm evening air. Che breathes slowly, carefully, each breath precious now. He does not know if this is his last day, his last week, his last month. But he knows that when he goes, finally, 58 years late, the revolution will continue without him. Cuba will continue. The arguments about what it all meant will continue. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all anyone gets, to make their mark on history, to do what they believe is right with the information they have, to live with the consequences, and to trust that future generations will learn from both the successes and the failures. The night deepens. The stars appear. And Che Guevara, the revolutionary who refused to die, who lived to see his dreams both realized and betrayed, closes his eyes and rests, knowing that morning will come again, that the island will wake again, that life will go on, whether he is here to witness it or not. The early months of 2026 stretch forward, and Che remains, suspended between life and whatever comes after. His existence has become small now, measured in moments rather than decades, in breaths rather than years. But even in this diminished state, the past comes to him with astonishing clarity, sharper somehow than the present, more vivid than the blurred figures of doctors and family members who move through his room. He remembers La Cabana fortress, where he served as commander after the revolution's victory. The trials, the executions, the men and women brought before revolutionary tribunals, some guilty of genuine atrocities under Batista, some guilty only of being on the losing side. He remembers the conviction he felt then, the absolute certainty that justice demanded these deaths, that the revolution could not afford mercy when the counter-revolution was waiting for any sign of weakness. But he also remembers specific faces now, a young soldier who wept before the firing squad, claiming he was just following orders. An old police officer who had, by some accounts, protected political prisoners from worse treatment. A businessman accused of collaboration, protesting his innocence to the end. Did they all deserve to die? Che had thought so at the time. Justice seemed clear, uncomplicated. But justice, he has learned, is never as simple as revolutionaries need it to be. Justice requires context, nuance, mercy, things that are difficult to maintain when you are fighting for survival, when you believe that the entire future depends on your victory, when compromise feels like betrayal. He wishes he could go back and be more careful, more discerning. But he also knows that if he went back with his current uncertainty, with his old man's complicated understanding of morality, he might not have been able to do what needed to be done. Revolution requires a kind of clarity that wisdom erodes. The Cuba of 2026 is preparing for something, though what exactly remains unclear. There are rumors of economic reforms, of political openings, of changes that might come when the last of the historic generation is finally gone. Che hears these rumors from visitors, from family members who try to keep him informed. But the details are fuzzy to him now, the distinctions between different policy proposals blurring into insignificance. What matters more to him, in these final months or weeks or days, is the question of what survives. Not him personally. He has made peace with mortality, has lived far longer than he had any right to expect. But what survives of the ideals? What remains of the dream that sent him into the Sierra Maestra, that made him believe that human society could be organized more justly, more rationally, more humanely? Cuba has survived, yes. The revolution persists in some form. But is it recognizable as the thing they fought for? The free healthcare and education remain, achievements worth celebrating. The absence of the desperate poverty that existed under Batista, worth acknowledging. But also the political repression, the economic stagnation, the sense that the island is trapped in amber, unable to move forward or backward, frozen in a revolutionary moment that passed decades ago. Is this what they fought for? Is this the best that could be achieved? Or did they make crucial mistakes, take wrong turns that could have been avoided if they had been wiser, more flexible, more willing to learn from failure? Che does not know. He suspects there are no good answers, only the messy, complicated reality of what happened, shaped by countless decisions and accidents and external pressures, too complex to reduce to simple judgments of success or failure. There is a young nurse who cares for him now, a woman in her 20s born long after the Soviet Union fell, who knows the revolution only as history, as the world her grandparents made. She is kind, professional, and sometimes, when she thinks he is sleeping, she checks her phone, scrolling through social media, watching videos of a world beyond Cuba, beyond the revolution, beyond the ideological battles of the 20th century. Che watches her sometimes through half-closed eyes, and he feels a strange tenderness toward her. She is what they fought for, in a way, an educated young woman with skills and dignity and options. She could have been a prostitute in Batista's Cuba, or a maid in a rich man's house, with no education, no prospects, no future. Instead, she is a nurse with training and a profession. That matters. That is real. But he also knows that she earns perhaps $30 a month, that her options are limited by politics and economics, that she dreams of leaving if she can, of finding opportunity elsewhere. And he cannot blame her. He left Argentina, after all. He left a comfortable life to seek something meaningful. Why should she not do the same? The revolution cannot ask people to sacrifice forever, cannot ask each generation to subordinate their personal dreams to collective ideals. At some point, the collective must serve the individual, must create space for people to flourish in their own ways. Cuba has struggled with this balance, has leaned too heavily on sacrifice, on duty, on the collective at the expense of personal freedom. And now the young nurse scrolls through her phone, dreaming of Miami or Madrid, and Che cannot tell her she is wrong. He can only hope that she remembers something of where she came from, something of the ideals that shaped her education, even if she cannot live her life entirely within those ideals. April 2026, and the island is celebrating the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs victory, 65 years since the exile army was defeated on the beaches, since Cuba proved that it could resist American power, that the revolution could survive. Che watches the celebration on television, sees the military parade, the speeches, the old veterans saluted by current leaders. He is too frail to attend, too weak even to sit up for long periods. But he watches, and he remembers. He remembers the terror of those days, the certainty that the invasion was just the beginning, that American forces would follow, that everything they had built would be crushed. He remembers the relief when the exiles were defeated, when it became clear that Kennedy would not send in the Marines, that the revolution had survived its greatest test. But he also remembers what came after, the missile crisis the following year, the world brought to the brink of nuclear war over Cuba, over this small island that had somehow become the focal point of superpower confrontation. He remembers arguing for a harder line, for accepting the Soviet missiles, for being willing to risk everything rather than back down. And he remembers the fear in people's eyes when they understood how close they had come to annihilation, how their revolution had nearly triggered an apocalypse. Would he make the same choices now? Would he still advocate for brinkmanship, for revolutionary purity over survival? Probably not. Age has made him cautious, has taught him that survival is not cowardice, that compromise is not always betrayal. But the young Che, the Che who believed that death was preferable to surrender, that man might have been right too, in his own way. Without that fierceness, that willingness to risk everything, the revolution would not have survived. But with it, the revolution came close to ending the world. May arrives, warm and humid, the beginning of the rainy season. Che's breathing is worse now, more labored, requiring oxygen almost constantly. The doctors say it could be days, or it could be weeks. The body, especially one that has endured as much as his, is unpredictable. He sleeps more than he is awake, and in sleep, the boundaries between memory and dream dissolve completely. He is in Bolivia again, captured, exhausted, waiting for execution. But this time the execution happens. He feels the bullets enter his body, feels himself falling, dying, and then he wakes, gasping for air, unsure which version is real, whether he died in 1967 or whether he has been living a strange extended dream for nearly 60 years. His family sits with him when they can. His children, grey-haired now themselves, holding his hand, telling him it is all right, that he can rest. But he is not sure it is all right. He is not sure he has earned rest. There are too many questions unanswered, too many consequences still unfolding. What will Cuba become when he is gone? When all the historic generation is gone? Will it finally open, finally transform into something new? Or will it cling to the past, to the revolutionary mythology, even as that mythology becomes increasingly hollow? He wants to believe that the best of what they built will survive, the commitment to education, to healthcare, to dignity for the poor. But he fears that the worst will survive too, the intolerance, the economic dysfunction, the political rigidity. Both legacies are his, both are theirs. And the next generation will have to sort through the inheritance, keeping what works, discarding what does not, building something that is neither pure revolution nor pure capitalism, but something adapted to their moment, their needs, their dreams. There is a moment, late one evening in mid-May, when Che is alone. The nurse has stepped out briefly, his family has gone home for the night, and he is awake, more alert than he has been in days. The room is quiet except for the hiss of the oxygen machine, the distant sound of Havana outside the window. And in that quiet, he makes peace with it. All of it. The violence and the idealism. The achievements and the failures. The people he saved and the people he killed. The dreams that came true and the dreams that turned to ash. He makes peace with the fact that he lived, when so many did not. That he survived Bolivia and grew old and had to watch the consequences unfold. That he did not get to be frozen in martyrdom, did not get to be remembered purely as the heroic guerrilla, but had to be human instead, complicated, flawed, aging, uncertain. Perhaps that is the gift, actually. Perhaps that is what his long survival taught him. That revolution is not about purity, not about achieving some perfect ideological state. Revolution is about people, messy and contradictional and difficult, trying to build something better with imperfect tools and limited understanding. They tried. They made mistakes. They also achieved things. And the world continues, the island continues, and new generations will try and fail and achieve in their own ways. The revolution is not a finished project. It is an ongoing conversation about what justice means, about how to organize society, about how to balance freedom and equality and security and dignity. And that conversation does not end just because his generation is dying off. It continues. It always continues. That is the real revolution, not the moment of victory, but the endless work of trying to be better, to do better, to create a world that serves human flourishing. And if they moved that conversation forward, even imperfectly, even at terrible cost, then perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all anyone can hope for. To move the conversation forward. To leave the world slightly different than you found it. To trust that those who come after will keep trying, keep struggling, keep building. Late May, and Che Guevara is still breathing. 97 years old, outliving everyone who marched with him into Havana, outliving the Soviet Union, outliving the Cold War, outliving the century of revolution itself. The television in his room shows news from around the world, political upheaval in Europe, economic uncertainty in the United States, climate disasters, technological advances, the constant churn of human history continuing without pause. And Cuba remains, smaller in the world's attention now than it was in 1959 or 1962, no longer the dangerous revolutionary threat or the romantic symbol of resistance, just a small island nation trying to navigate the 21st century with the burden of its 20th century history. Che watches when he can, when his eyes will focus, and he sees that the world moved on, that the grand ideological battle that defined his life, capitalism versus communism, imperialism versus liberation, the United States versus the Soviet Union, ended not with a climactic final conflict but with a whimper, with the collapse of one side and the troubled victory of the other, and with the persistence of all the same problems that the ideologies were supposed to solve. Poverty still exists. Inequality still exists. Exploitation still exists. But so does hope, so does resistance, so does the human capacity to imagine something better and to fight for it, even imperfectly. That does not end. That cannot end. As long as people suffer unjustly, there will be people who refuse to accept it, who organize, who resist, who try to build alternatives. They will not call it communism anymore, maybe. They will not wave the same flags or sing the same songs. But the impulse, the fundamental human impulse toward justice, toward dignity, toward equality, that survives. That is Che's real legacy, perhaps. Not the specific policies or the economic model or the political system Cuba built, but the reminder that resistance is possible, that the powerful can be challenged, that the future is not predetermined, that people can make history, even if they cannot control exactly how that history unfolds. June begins, and the doctors say it is very close now. His organs are failing, his body shutting down in the slow, inexorable way that age eventually demands. His family gathers, preparing for the end. The government makes quiet plans for a state funeral, for the ceremonies that will mark the passing of the last revolutionary, the final link to the generation that made modern Cuba. But Che himself is mostly beyond these preparations. He drifts, surfacing occasionally into consciousness, sinking back into memory and dream. He is in the Sierra Maestra again, always the Sierra Maestra, climbing through the jungle, exhausted and exhilarated, believing that they are building the future with every step. He is in Havana in January 1959, riding into the city in triumph, seeing the crowds, feeling the impossible joy of victory. He is in the Soviet Union, arguing with bureaucrats, frustrated by the gap between revolutionary theory and socialist reality. He is in the Congo, watching another revolutionary dream collapse in the African jungle. He is in Bolivia, captured, defeated, waiting for death. He is in the decades after, watching, aging, surviving. All of it is present now, all at once, the linear progression of time collapsing into a single moment where everything he has been exists simultaneously. And he understands, finally, that there are no answers. There are only questions, and the courage to keep asking them. There is only the attempt, the struggle, the endless human effort to create meaning and justice and beauty in a world that does not automatically provide these things. They tried. He tried. And the trying matters, even when the results are ambiguous, even when success and failure are so entangled that they cannot be separated. The trying is what makes us human. The refusal to accept injustice, even when we do not know exactly how to fix it. The willingness to sacrifice, even when the sacrifice might be in vain. The courage to imagine something better, even when that imagining leads us into tragedy. Mid-June now, 2026. The summer heat wraps around Havana like a heavy blanket. In his room, kept cool by the air conditioning that his status as historic revolutionary affords, Che Guevara lies in the narrow space between life and death, breathing but barely, conscious but distantly. The nurse checks his vital signs, adjusts the oxygen, monitors the slow decline. His family sits vigil, waiting. And outside, Cuba continues. The street vendors sell their goods. The musicians play on the malecon. The students attend the universities that the revolution built. The dissidents whisper their critiques. The bureaucrats manage the economy. The tourists snap photographs. The young people scroll through their phones, dreaming of escape or of change or simply of tomorrow. All of it continues, the vast complicated machinery of a society, shaped by history but not imprisoned by it, carrying the weight of the past but also reaching toward the future. And Che, even in his diminished state, even with death approaching, feels a strange peace about this. The world does not need him anymore. It has not needed him for years, decades perhaps. But it goes on. Cuba goes on. The revolution, in whatever form it now takes, goes on. And new generations will make their own choices, their own mistakes, their own achievements. As it should be. As it must be. The old revolutionaries cannot govern forever. They cannot impose their vision eternally. At some point, they have to let go, have to trust that they planted seeds that will grow in ways they cannot control or predict. Some of those seeds will flourish. Some will wither. Some will grow into something completely unexpected. But that is the nature of planting seeds. You do not get to determine the harvest. You only get to tend the ground, to do your best, and to hope. Late June, and Che Guevara is 97 years old, lying in a hospital bed in Havana, surrounded by medical equipment and memories, his body failing but his mind still flickering with consciousness, with awareness, with the full weight of a life that stretched across nearly a century. The doctors say it could be hours now. His breathing is shallow, irregular. His family holds his hands, whispers their love, their gratitude, their forgiveness for whatever needs forgiving. And Che, in the spaces between breaths, in the quiet moments when the pain recedes enough for thought, considers his life one final time. Ernesto Guevara, the Argentine medical student who became Che, the revolutionary, the guerrilla, the icon, the symbol, the old man dying slowly in Havana. What was it all for? Did it matter? Will anyone remember the truth of it, or only the mythology? And he realizes, with the clarity that sometimes comes at the end, that it does not matter. What matters is that they tried. What matters is that when they saw injustice, they fought it. What matters is that they believed human beings could organize society more justly, more humanely, and they dedicated their lives to that belief, even though the reality fell short of the dream. The dream itself was worthy. The attempt was worthy. And if the next generation learns from their mistakes as well as their successes, if they build something better by understanding what worked and what did not, then it was worth it. Then the struggle, the sacrifice, the pain and the joy and the terrible, complicated, beautiful mess of revolution, it was worth it. Outside his window, the sun is setting over Havana, painting the city in gold and orange and deep purple. The same sun that rose over the Sierra Maestra, over Batista's Cuba, over the Bay of Pigs, over the missile crisis, over the special period, over every triumph and failure of the revolution. The same sun that will rise tomorrow over an island that is still here, still struggling, still surviving, still trying to be better. And Che closes his eyes, breathing slowly, steadily, each breath a quiet victory over time. And he rests, knowing that morning will come again, knowing that the revolution, in whatever form it takes, will continue, knowing that he has lived long enough to see the complexity, the tragedy, the hope, and that perhaps that is enough, perhaps that is all anyone can ask, to live long enough to understand that there are no easy answers, only the questions, only the struggle, only the endless human effort to build something worthy, and that effort continues, always continues, beyond him, beyond his generation, into the future, where new voices will ask the same questions, and find their own answers, and build their own dreams, and make their own mistakes, and keep trying, always trying, because that is what it means to be human, to refuse to accept the world as it is, to imagine what it could be, and to fight for that vision, imperfectly, incompletely, but sincerely, with everything you have, until your last breath, and even beyond, because the revolution does not end when the revolutionary dies. It continues, in the ideas, in the institutions, in the people, in the endless conversation about justice and dignity and freedom and equality. It continues, and Che Guevara, the man who should have died at 39 in a Bolivian schoolhouse, the man who lived instead for 58 more years, watching the consequences of his choices unfold, learning what survival teaches that martyrdom cannot, he finally lets go, and the island continues, and the revolution continues, and time continues, flowing forward like a river, carrying everyone downstream, toward destinations unknown, toward futures unwritten, toward the next chapter of a story that has no ending, only continuations, only transformations, only the eternal human struggle to be better, to do better, to create a world worth inheriting. And that struggle goes on, beyond Che, beyond Cuba, beyond this moment, into tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow.